Thank you for that introduction, and most importantly, thanks Integer for inviting me here. I'm going to speak today probably more on where we are, where we might go to, and how we might get there in terms of particularly off-highway end-use testing. The picture shown at the bottom, and it doesn't look too bad on the screen, but it's pretty pixelated because that was 1999, and that's actually gaseous and PM measurement. That would be a quartz crystal microbalance, which would have been the predecessor to the first sensors incorporated units for particulate matter measurement on board. So I think maybe I skipped, there we go. So in the U.S., the regulatory announcement for a final rule came out. I think there's a date there of June 2005. And we've kind of been working according to the principles of that document, as well as the measurement allowance program that was largely conducted at Southwest Research. So the program history, it would be safe to say that the consent decree between the heavy-duty, 6 heavy-duty settling manufacturers and the U.S. DOJ kicked off a lot of that. We were engaged by them to take what Leo Breton and Dennis Johnson at the EPA had termed Rover and kind of dieselize that technology so that it would be more applicable and at least more palatable from an accuracy standpoint as viewed by the engine manufacturers in proving out the changes that were made as a result of the agreement of in the consent decree. So from then, we were involved a lot in the on-road pilot program pieces as well as the on-road heavy-duty manufacturer run program. And you can see some of the information there. Obviously not going to read all of that, but we'll get back to some of those requirements and what's happened there. For heavy-duty end-use testing, the compliance requirements, you use a PEMS, a portable emissions measurement system. You continuously record a number of channels, not only including gaseous emissions, particulate matter emissions, those concentrations, exhaust flow rate, ambient conditions, and any ECU broadcast. The quantity of data collection under the end-use testing on-road program, it's 1 full shift day with at least 3 hours of non-idle operation. There are screening, adjustment, and test vehicle mileage requirements in 86-1908. And then, of course, all the reporting requirements are there. But, basically, the takeaway from this is being able to get the non-idle operation and get, meaningful data in reference to the not-to-exceed operating zone that we'll go over here in just a minute. What are the challenges that we've seen, or what's the industry seen? A number of them. Integration of a number of systems. So most important here is probably time alignment. You've got a lot of raw data coming in, and the alignment of those data it has proven to be the most critical component in the accuracy or representativeness of the data. I know that Bill Silvas led some efforts at AVL for the EMA and EPA ARB emissions testing committee. And he basically took sums of raw data, combined them in a number of different ways, and I think even across standards like ISO and Euro and EPA, US EPA and ARB, there were kind of plus or minus 2% or less differences, with time alignment showing differences, spreads of like 30%. So it's definitely the most critical piece of information that you need to pay particular attention to. It's very challenging to achieve trouble-free PEMS operation for an 8-hour period. I'll say that has gotten markedly improved. When we started with our in-house integrated systems in the early 2000s, I worked around about a 30% success rate for test cycles. When we did some manufacturer run reporting for some of the OEMs, we were probably at a 50 to 60% success rate. And then now recently, we're probably in the 80% success rate, so things have improved quite a bit. Accuracy has improved quite nicely as well. Durability and the ability of the units to live in the harsh environments, we'll call it, of in-use on-road testing has improved. Field evaluation of PIMS data validity has been critical to the OEMs as well as to the regulators, and I think that if I were king for a day, revisiting kind of the measurement allowance program and where do we stand now and what maybe we can gain for the future would be in order. And then most importantly, and why I think maybe some people have the vision of PIMS testing much different than my vision, is that it's far more than a calculator. You can't just turn it on, collect the data, and report the data. It's still at a fairly high level of expertise when it comes to QC/QA of the data. So what's really involved? You need to define the NTE zone. This is beyond mounting the equipment on the vehicle and making sure it doesn't fall off, making sure that it doesn't get rained on, a number of different things. Determine what the threshold values are, then start characterizing the NT events of the collected in-use data, and then apply any allowable exclusions to those data. The key here is that we've done a lot of work with some independent parties, and we've developed independent code internally. We've looked at some of the PIMS manufacturer's software. We've actually developed a set of data that that we've been using to kind of test out some of the software for exclusions and definitions of operating zones and those types of things. And that's really not trying to show that I wouldn't even claim that we are right and someone's wrong, but that anyone is wrong. But there's a lot of interpretation involved in regulation, as you know, and I think just using that bit of data or using some common set of data to develop commonality in those interpretations would be important. I've always been puzzled as although a participant of the round robin program, you're presented with an engine and its controls, but you're not presented with any data. So it's an end-to-end comparison, but what my lab's reduction code does and your lab's reduction code does could be two completely different things. So it would be interesting to see a bit of data to go around with that so we can check to make sure everyone's adding 2 + 2 the same way. NT zone boundaries are fairly well defined, and bear with me if this is at a kindergarten level for some of you. I didn't know what my audience would be used to, but I've got a little cartoon that will kind of describes the intricacies of looking at NT zone operation and why we might want to look to go away from that. But basically it's defined by speed and torque bounds and as well as power conditions on a normalized torque map. So we look at the current FTP cycle under the FTP, or under the NTE, sorry, you can see the number of events. And I don't know if you can read, so about 26% of the NTE operating points lie within the NTE region. That's FTP operating points, sorry. And 12% of the FTP cycle results in an NTE event with an NTE test with 3 distinct events. So not much information can even be gleaned from a NTE frame of reference from the FTP cycle. And you got similar things occurring with the World Harmonized Test Cycle. See what it looks like real time. The data on the bottom is a bit of off-road data that we took, and you can see the points as they populate. And the problem is remember, these have to be continuous windows. So even though we're going inside the NTE zone, unless we're there for a consecutive 30-second time, we aren't able to include that as a point, and nor are we able to include that operation. Admittedly, also that this is a small amount of operation, but it does show you that as many would see, a lot of the vocations, particularly in off-highway, there's a lot of idle that would get discounted from an NTE approach. Excuse me for only looking at the U.S. and Europe. I'm not trying to be what would that be, hemispherical centric or something in my view of the world. But obviously those are the two areas that have been so active in terms of in-use testing. The work window approach currently being considered by the European Commission is not something new. Matt Spears, EPA, has been a proponent of that for a number of years. We did quite a bit of work. In fact, one of our colleagues, Dr. Ben Shade, who's now with ABL, did a lot of work on work window approaches in the early to mid 2000s. But basically, you consider more of the data, but you're looking at totaling work in a work-based window over a given unit of time, and then comparing that average power of those windows against peak power, and then qualifying that data and integrating those emissions data within those windows of operation. So considerably different in that it does include idle operation, but obviously because of the minimum power requirement averaged over the window, you could discount some of those data as well. With the proposed non-road program, there's not a test route specified like the EU on-highway program, and that's largely why there are more exclusions allowed in the proposed non-road program. So the current U.S. non-road in-use emissions compliance program status, and I robbed this slide presentation from OTAC from June 10th of 2014. And you can see that no program is currently in place, currently discussing the schedule for development with industry, and that's still where we are. We know that the EPA and ARB has been very busy with some small programs. You may have heard of them, greenhouse gas and NOx. So I think that's a lot of the reason that the in-use testing for non-road has been pushed back. I'm actually, it's nice to be just the objective third party, so I have no skin in the game like an OEM would have, but I'm glad to see it be delayed, because it has allowed for the PIM systems to mature, and particularly in durability, and I know the challenges of that bit of testing that's on the cover slide, that work went over about a 4-day period, and I think we had about 2 hours worth of valid test data. And from that test data, you're not getting a lot of information regarding the picture of what the vehicle's emissions contribution is. So current Euro in-use testing, again, non-road still pending. RDE will officially kick off September 2017. And I think many of you know what the package decisions and approvals look like. So incentive programs for enforcement. I was asked to speak a little bit about this. Notice the page isn't too full. I think that if there were many incentives, you would see a lot of OEMs doing the work already. I think that one of the things that maybe hasn't been brought to light is that I personally see, of all the requirements of a manufacturer, I see OBD and in-use testing in a similar vein, that there can be significant benefit to the OEM through those requirements. So as you make your OBD compliance stronger, I think you've got a tool for development purposes, and I think you've got the same thing with in-use testing. So I think, the folks that have been involved with in-use and on-highway, I know there's a number of horror stories, but the limited amount of work I've done with various OEMs in the non-road market, I always caveat the stories, with that there are meaningful data there above and beyond just your compliance requirements. I think that using in-use compliance as a means of promoting geofencing, which a lot of people are talking about. Obviously, geofencing takes on a whole different meaning when you're talking about a lot of non-road equipment, because the fence isn't very large, perhaps. But I think the in-use compliance tool could be beneficial in strengthening those arguments. An in-use based certification whereby a manufacturer would certify to a certain standard and then collect those data in field to do a prove out of that to apply for credits for exceeding performance requirements. That's another way to incentivize. The next bullet point maybe isn't for the OEM as much as it is for the fleets or the owners of these non-road vehicles. But again, doing permit and fuel tax waivers, participation is a key point with in-use testing, finding candidate vehicles, being able to pull them out of service, and keeping the owner happy. It's a difficult thing when you've been in the field for 2 days straight, it's been pouring down the rain, and it's kind of 10 o'clock at night. The owner's still there. They're looking over your shoulder, and you have to turn around with a frown on your face and say, well, it wasn't any good. And then you're begging for the third day's worth of testing. So it really, anything we can do to incentivize participation is key. And then also using the in-use testing approach as part of a phase-in program for accelerated improvements in emissions performance. Long-term goals and next steps. I think first, a summary is kind of in order. So from the manufacturer run in-use program, and I believe these data are correct. I was involved quite a bit with this, and I've been involved with many committees. Have not verified, and I don't know that I could possibly verify, but there are basically two phases of the program, and it's largely viewed upon as, phase one is the initial in-use prove out. If everything passes with kind of flying colors, you don't even have to proceed to a phase two. There were several hundred tests as part of the manufacturer run program. There were no failures. I know that of one anecdotal story about misfueling of a vehicle that resulted in anomalies that were finally linked to that fueling issue. But to my knowledge, no phase two testing was ever required of a manufacturer. So I don't know if we view that as a highly successful in-use testing program, but I can say that if one were looking at in-use testing solely for the reason of identifying a defeat device, it looks to me like it was a pretty successful program and that there weren't defeat devices being employed. The next steps would obviously start with the proposed rulemaking. I know that the in-use testing committees have met and have provided information to EPA and ARB, and again, that rulemaking is still pending. An off-highway pilot, I think that's still going to have to happen. But is it similar in guidelines to the on-road pilot program? I don't think it's going to be an NTE. I think that NTE was a very good first approximation. I think that the measurement allowance was a very good first approximation, but I think that's going to require a revisit of those both the how you measure and how you gauge the data set, and what the exclusions and requirements are going to be. Maybe it's not going to be work-based, NOx or CO2 based, or greenhouse gas based windows. Maybe a more appropriate approach to further link, the greenhouse gas or fuel economy to emissions requirements. What will the exclusions look like? Well, the exclusions will have to go hand in hand with what the measurement program will be. Is it a window approach or more of a zonal approach? Direct exhaust flow measurement or surrogate measurement. I think this is probably the most important or most tricky component of non-road, just due to exhaust configurations and exhaust outlets, provisions by these vehicles to do temperature protection or insulation of those outlets, being able to attach to those, being able to strap the equipment on there to get that, having access to the data stream that a lot of OEMs have for I would probably be willing to say all have to estimate intake flow rate or exhaust flow rate would be very beneficial. Again, moving windows or the windows, how much of the windows overlap. Um, right now, it's a step increment of 1 second for the work-based Windows approaches. Do we have vocation-specific options? Are you making concessions based on vocations that have high idle time or high or low duty cycles, and not only options in terms of meeting the requirements, but also options in terms of how we make recommendations for what the test requirements in general are. I mean, if we're running a generator set that operates at 2 points and you get 2 points of operation with a sufficient amount of data, is there any reason to test 3 or 4 shifts on that vocation? Conformity factors, is it going to be a conformity factor approach like the work-based window employees, or is it going to be a vehicle pass ratio, much like the heavy-duty in-use on-road for the U.S.? What will the power thresholds look like? I know there's a lot of talk about more and more idle time, so we can get an indication of, do we look at more idle restriction, bearing in mind that idle time does impact the performance of catalysts, and the more catalysts that are employed, this data does become more important. How will the testing be conducted? Is it going to be third party, or is it all going to be OEM conducted? Obviously the folks at ARB and EPA would have to employ several more people in order to do all of the conformity testing themselves. Bill, that would help your budget, I'm sure. Ultimately, one of the things that I'm critical of is, how does this play with, does it help or hurt harmonization? I'm a big proponent of that. I think that it makes a lot of sense, not only from a measurement standpoint, but if you're going to ask for technology introduction, I think harmonizing it makes it far more palatable to the OEMs and to the tier 1 suppliers. So long-term goals, I think we first have to define what the goal is. Are we looking at an in-use testing program simply to identify defeat devices? Or, are we looking at very high accuracy data from the field? We need to make that clear. We need to be very cognizant of the ramifications. One of the things that worries me about this post-VW era is that anyone can go purchase a PIMS, and then the media outlets are very open to talking to anyone that has PIMS data at the current time. And if you're not very careful about the accuracy of that data, there's a lot of ramifications for the OEM and ultimately for you, as a result of sharing that data. So I think care needs to be taken in the QC/QA process. Strengthening OBD, and the reason I say this is I think that if you're going to require OBD sensors and the development of those types of platforms, being able to use those platforms for in-use compliance can make a lot of sense, if nothing else, but to have corroboration of data or a validation tool for data. Increase the amount of data, whether it's PAMs or PIMs or micro PIMs, whatever you want to say, trying to get maybe less accurate, more cost conscious technologies that will, like screening devices, that will allow you to have a lot of data that gives you vehicle activity data that you can use from a modeling standpoint to look at technology benefits, introduction into and its inherent impact on emissions in the environment. There's got to be more stringent standards that are coming, and we know that those don't translate one-to-one to real-world emissions production. So we need to validate what those technology implementations are. I think a key point is the lack of compliance. Lax in compliance creates an atmosphere whereby other competing manufacturers are almost enticed to do similar things in order to be competitive in a market. I'm not making any challenges, but we've seen from just a fuel economy standpoint and the way that coast downs and those things are being conducted in Europe, that there's a lot of commonality in approaches, and I think that even though it sounds that strange that a manufacturer would ever compliment someone for finding a flaw or defeat device, we've gotten many compliments that said it's at least a level playing field now. We were really challenged in trying to meet the same kind of performance standards that Volkswagen had. The impact of the future regulations on the consumer is really important as well, I believe. I stole some slides from actually Leo Breton from DOE, who I think had stolen them from John Hord. So I'm at least, if I'm an accessory, I'm once removed. But the key here, I think, is that he says draws a lot of the same conclusions, that it's non-trivial. We could use it rather than audits for enforcement. It's important to find out how the vehicle learns no matter what the driver does. And if it was easy, no one would really need us to be doing this. Leo himself made some points about the blind testing kind of concept, and I would have to disagree with kind of two of these. I think you're going to have to always have intimate information from the manufacturers that will make the data more valuable, particularly like I mentioned in off-highway that it's going to be a challenge to mount all the subsystems. And I don't believe that relying on OBD, because I think from a robust OBD program on the light-duty spark ignited program, just using that as an example, I think you've seen many states on the I&M side go only to an OBD diagnostic scan, and to this day I don't think we see major problems. The consumer impact, ultimately we've got to watch how the end-use testing, affects that. It obviously will impact cost. Does that cost get passed on to the consumer? Does the end-use testing accelerate technology that ultimately ends in durability and maintenance problems? And I think we saw some of that with the acceleration of EGR and DPF in the heavy truck market. Technology innovation and investigating the trade-off is really key here, I think. And obviously the goal is consumer satisfaction while improving air quality. A couple of the things that we're doing, the drive cycle development, where we can take these cycle information from the field, create new test cycles, and not from a surprise test cycle standpoint, but we've done a lot of our own development of next generation. We worked with Volvo Trucks and taking an 07, making it 2010 compliant with SCR. So being able to surprise yourself in a development process, and then micro PIMs or scanning tools that you can get a lot larger numbers of instruments on board. Again, defining what your goal is. If it's a defeat device, something like this can likely raise an eyebrow, and then you go in with a more accurate, more robust PIMS unit. I would normally stop here, but being that the last year's been kind of taxing in terms of media attention, I do want to make some clarification. We did not find any defeat device. We had a 3-vehicle data set, which we tried to involve both OEMs, Volkswagen and BMW, and both declined. We initiated some of the discovery and put the data out there publicly. Our years of experience have probably helped us reach some of the conclusions in our project, and it probably gave somewhat of a reputation that when people looked at it, it wasn't just kind of scoffed at. ARB is the one that kind of picked up the torch and ran with it and did the hard work, heavy lifting. And I want to clarify also, we've gotten a lot of, was EPA and ARB asleep at the wheel? No, enforcement takes time. There's a lot of procedures that you have to follow. There's negotiations. So, everything happened in what I believe due time. There was a nice commercial that Volkswagen did, and so a cartoonist kind of took the commercial and made it into a different outcome. And then that spawned the whole term Dieselgate. Well, that's probably the worst term I've ever heard, and I can't tell you how much I hate that term. We firmly believe that clean diesel is not a myth. I mean, it's an important part of achieving the greenhouse gas requirements of the future. We initiated a study just so that we could promote clean diesel technology, particularly in the light duty segment. I've gone from, I don't even remember what the first PM standards when I started measuring, but NOx was 4 or 5 grams, and we're now working with OEMs to produce 0.02. So NOx and PM have been controlled remarkably well, and the real truth is this is a constant work in progress. So with that, thank you.